It's my pleasure to introduce the next session. This is about leadership that heals, and I'd like to introduce Joanna Giannes to you. She's going to be appearing on screen live. She's a leadership development specialist with more than 2 decades of leadership practice and research. She has a background in psychotherapy with a postgraduate qualification in organisational learning and a master's degree in education. Her work has taken her across Australia and overseas, where she's supported numerous organisations in culture change, led award-winning community leadership programs, co-designed and created Aboriginal and cross-cultural women's civic leadership programs, through to integrating social enterprise education in addressing social issues. Raised in the oral tradition, Joanna draws from her Hellenic ancestry of mythology, archetypes, elements and ancient healing ways to support people and communities to move towards wholeness. So please join with me in welcoming Joanna.
Hello. Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me and see me? Or a raise of arms? Yes, I think it's working. Gosh, I am so excited to be here, and I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from Adelaide in South Australia, and I like to pay respects to the Kaurna people, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I'm speaking from. And I understand that many of you are on Ruwanina country. So deep respects to all elders past, present and emerging. And of course to Tassie leaders for the invitation. Now, here I would also like to acknowledge the wisdom, the teachings, and in this presentation, the wisdom, the images of others who have supported my practice. So here you'll see there'll be some images in here that are from a Greek artist in the southern Peloponnese called Manolis Grigorias, archetypal and future thinking Christina Driza, restorative leadership from the late Sienna Stefan and Jamie Resmovitz, leaders as healers, Nicholas Jani, attunement and mindfulness, Dr. Lee Burrows, relational intelligence, Esther Perel, storytelling, Dr. Martin Shaw, and deep gratitude to my long-time Jungian psychoanalyst and cantadora, which means the keeper of the old stories, Dr. Clarissa Pinkola-Estes, the late Dr. Angeles Ariane, my parents and my Hellenic ancestors, for the timeless wisdoms and practices that continue to support our contemporary world. Now, I wanted to do this for 2 reasons. One, because I think it's always really important that we acknowledge where we draw our information from. But I also wanted to share with you that acknowledgement is one of the universal arms of love. And there are other arms of love, and they are gratitude, validation, acceptance, and recognition. Where this is important, certainly for those of you who are leaders in your communities and your workplaces, there was a survey that was done many, many years ago, and it's had several iterations since. And it was done originally by one of my mentors, Dr. John Hill. And the question essentially he asked was, what do workers want from their work? And asked the same question to their supervisors. What do you think workers want from their work? And the answers were quite surprising. But in regards to this acknowledgement, the number one thing that workers wanted was appreciation for work done. The second thing was feeling in on things. And the third thing was consideration of personal problems. What was interesting is the supervisors had them as the bottom 3. Things have changed since that survey, but fundamentally only one thing has shifted, and that's job security. So just remember, an acknowledgement is the arm of love, and it goes to the heart of what so many of us find so important. So what is this concept, leadership that heals? So some of you will have heard of Hippocrates and his central tenets that we do no harm. And they served as the moral and ethical compass of the medical profession. So fast forward 2,400 years, this Hippocratic oath, to many degrees, is still taken, and it's still relevant to the medical profession in the way they undertake their practice and their ethics. So here's a question for you to consider. Can leaders also adopt this oath and seek to heal organisations, businesses and communities? I would say yes. And the invitation throughout this presentation is for you to also consider what that might look like in your own organisations. So we're going to explore some practices and processes that support building trust, integrity, shared meaning and connection. Now, I got really excited when I heard Parker Palmer. So whilst he was talking, I've actually changed some of my slides. So I'm going to skip through very quickly some of these. Now, Angela Driver introduced you earlier to the Edelman 2020 Trust Barometer. And so very quickly, we can see again that inequity is undermining trust globally. Fears currently eclipsing hope. People are really wanting competence and ethics as the two primary drivers of trust. And where we can actually do something about it is through partnerships. That's where we can build trust. And what I'm proposing is in partnerships, what we're looking for are a very different set of skills and qualities in our people. And we call this boundary spanners. People who can straddle multiple spheres and draw from different ways of knowing and embody what we call post-heroic qualities. Just some context for you that I think might be useful, and that is COVID has what we call now turbocharged VUCA. Can I just get a bit of a sense in the room? Is VUCA an acronym most of you are familiar with? Hands up. Some hands. Okay, well then I better tell you what it is. So VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. And if it wasn't complex enough 10 months ago, COVID has thrown a whole nother spanner in the works. What we know is that wicked problems now seem even more wicked. I'm drawing now from Australian futurist Kristina Driza, who's actually based in Lithuania at the moment. She can't get home. So she is very happy to come home soon, but at the moment she's based over there. And some of her recent findings indicate that there is some different complexities that we're going to be dealing with. And these are called grey rhinos. So these wicked problems as we know them are grey rhinos. Grey rhinos versus black swans. So grey rhinos are what we can actually see coming. Black swans are crises that occur that we haven't seen coming, and we mitigate. We can't mitigate for them necessarily. We work and develop strategies after that event. But grey rhinos, we can see them coming, and this is the world currently that we're living in, and that is attacks on trust and truth, biosecurity, technological disruption, nuclear, climate change, or some of the language that's being used at the moment is climate abuse, next level impact of COVID-19, catastrophic earthquakes, globalisation of white supremacy, and the unknown, so the things we don't even know. So whilst that seems incredibly daunting, stay with me, we have hope. And as long as we're around, I think we have to have this unrelenting optimism that Marty Linsky, who is the author of Adaptive Leadership, talks about. We also need to acknowledge that adding to this complex environment is an increasing acceptance that we are navigating a post-truth, post-democracy, and post-human world. So political scientist Colin Crouch coined this terminology post-democracy, whereby he asserts there is a global movement where societies continue to have the use and privilege of the existing structures of democracy, however, place less weight on these structures that are increasingly contributing to a trivialisation of democracy. It was very interesting listening to Kate and where democracy is currently being viewed. Another recent survey in the UK indicated that something just like over 50% of young people did not believe that democracy was the best form of governance. I'll let you think about that for a moment. So with a post-human world, we're referring to the rise of artificial intelligence, where every aspect of our life will be affected and impacted by AI, due to machines having sophisticated capacities to think and act like humans. But have faith, they're not humans yet, and there's a lot of work that we can do. So some other considerations for us to be aware of is that for many of us, we have a completely new relationship to time. We're always living on the now, where the priorities of the moment seem to be everything. So we're constantly distracted. There is a change of focus to globo sapiens, a conception of 21st century citizens who are willing to think critically and now to start assuming responsibility of their impact on communities and the planet. There is a need for us to really become very skilled at observing patterns. The reason for this, when we can observe patterns and we can disrupt patterns and change patterns, there is a need for us to be considering exnovation as well as innovation. I heard innovation being talked about this morning. I would also encourage you that we need to know when it's time to let some things go in our existing practices. So rather than constantly this trajectory of innovation, what non-essentials can we let go of in our existing practice and just clean that up first? The need for cognitive diversity, and what we mean here is how can we have both the poet and the engineer at the same table, the leader and the healer at the same table? So earlier there was a mention about groupthink. It's really important that we have diversity in its fullest sense, and that we start to think more broadly even than blue sky thinking, that we're starting to look at black sky thinking 100 years out. So we also know that we have to move beyond the monomyth that many of us have been exposed to. That's been the dominant narrative in our lives. And we have to do that because all the macro narratives are in crisis. The unknown and the uncertain now are the new normal. And the old linear ways of working are unsustainable in an accelerated world. Cognitive reasoning alone cannot lead to transformation in an unknown world. So when it came earlier, when I just spoke about exnovation, it also means we have to understand the cycles of life, that there are cycles of birth, growth, full bloom, harvest, decay, death, and economically, expansion, contraction, recession. We cannot always be in the season of spring. So, us leadership educators get very excited about this terminology, this what we call post-heroic leadership. And I would posit that these are actually trust-building qualities. To be an effective boundary spanner and to straddle multiple disciplines, we need to be developing these kind of qualities: empathy, open-mindedness, compassion, the strong ability to synthesize information, emotional maturity, integrity. I've written there, as above, so below. It's not enough when it comes to trust that you just do the right thing in public. You need to do the right thing at home too, right? That's integrity. Integrity is in all dimensions of my life. I am congruent. Really strong communication skills and deep, deep listening. And we'll talk about that in a little while. So I would say that these skills are incredibly healing skills, and they're actually the sweet spot between leading and healing. So how do we create healing organisations? Can these two archetypes coexist? There's another two archetypes that we have cross-culturally, and they are, so there's leader, there's healer, there's visionary, and there's teacher. But today we're going to look at leading and healing. So, I think this is the bridge. This extraordinary human being who is no longer with us developed a set of, and that's Sienna Stephan, created this set of ideals and principles that she called restorative leadership. And there's actually an organisation in the United States called the Restorative Leadership Institute. I think this is the bridge. And so restorative leadership embraces the interconnectedness of all life and acts for the highest benefit of all. So like in the Hippocratic Oath, restorative leadership strives to do no harm and to heal the earth, the communities, and ourselves, moving towards a balanced expression of universal values and natural laws. It quite intentionally seeks to address the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and progress on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So here are some of the principles of restorative leadership. We always take the long view. We're very intentional with life's impacts, and we leverage the interconnectedness for cascading benefit. So I'll just pause there just for a moment. So when we talk about the interconnectedness for cascading benefit, we can go right back to that Edelman Trust Barometer, where they talk about the need for partnership and collaboration. But many of you will be familiar with the terminology complex adaptive problems and perhaps even wicked problems. The difference between the two, wicked problems require government as a key partner. So we need, from a restorative leadership perspective, we need to have all parties at the table. Government has to be one of those parties. Restorative leadership goes on that it operates off a belief that goodness abounds and that we ask and listen, align and co-create, and we scale across shared values, and we go net generous relationally, which means assume positive intent from your people. And to do this, it means that you have to have trust in your people. I see a real connection between restorative leadership and between another set of practices called appreciative inquiry. We don't have time today to go through appreciative inquiry, but if you're interested in this, make a note. The person that developed appreciative inquiry is a man called David Cooperrider. Highly recommend you have a look at his work too. So let's have a look at creating healing organisations. I got very excited when Parker Palmer talked about story and the need for autobiographical storytelling. One of the things that I do as a leadership educator, it's not unusual for me to be involved in the opening retreats quite often in leadership programs. So for an example, this year alone, I have taken 80 people in different guises. We take them away probably between 2 and 3 days at a time. We lock them in. They don't know each other. And by the end of it, by the end of the 3 days, they walk away having developed very, very strong and deep connections. A methodology I use to do that is autobiographical storytelling. And very simply, I call it my story. So when Parker Palmer talked about the importance of our autobiographical storytelling as a mechanism to build trust, I can concur that this process absolutely deepens relationships. The invitation for you, and we'll break off into just a little exercise in a moment, is to think about how you might be able to integrate processes in your own organisations that invite what this slide that you can see, Cameron Yarbrough, who's the CEO of an organisation called Torch, calls level 3 conversations. So they've come up, I don't agree with all the language here, but that's not the point, but they've come up with 3 types of conversations that can happen in a psychologically safe organisation. They talk about level 1, surface level conversations, the water cooler type, you know, that casual exchange of factual information, perhaps some interests and goals, you know, what was the footy like on the weekend? Level 2 is starting to get into personal conversations, it's riskier topics like perhaps your opinions or your feelings on the work or the organisation and your role and your participation in it. Level 3 is the vulnerable and the human conversations. And this is where real connectivity happens. They are the difficult conversations. So the invitation here is to consider just for a minute or two in your own, I'm just going to skip through that, in your own, for those of you online, on your own, for those of you in the room, feel free to talk to the person next to you just for a couple of minutes, tops, I'll time it. And here's the question: what, in terms of the culture in your organisation, what level would you say it's at? And where would you begin in creating a level 3 environment in your organisation where failures, fears, vulnerabilities, strengths can truly be discussed? And how can you integrate something, a modality like autobiographical storytelling in your people and culture strategies? 90 seconds. I'm going to time it. Turn to your partner. Those of you online, just make some notes for yourself. Okay, I might bring you back, and I know you might have only just started on the first question, and that's okay. You will get a copy of these slides, so I do invite you, have these conversations in your work. Bring them into your next team meeting. What would happen? What would come to the surface? So let's look at leadership that heals. And this quote is from a leadership educator called Otto Scharmer. Some of you may have heard of Otto Scharmer. And he says, the key leadership challenge of our time is to shift the inner place from which we operate. As individuals, as teams, as institutions, and as societies, we all face the same issue, that doing more of the same won't fix flawed and failed systems. We have to leave behind our old tools, and behaviours and immerse ourselves in the places of most potential. We have to listen with our minds and our hearts wide open, and then connect with our deep sources of knowing and self. Nicholas Janney, who has written quite a lot regarding leading and healing, goes on to say that there is nothing more inspiring and nothing more urgent than leaders who include the very best of rational thinking while operating from a deeper level of wisdom and intelligence. And here, I particularly want to highlight two elements that he talks about. That's integration and connectedness, and nurturing and regeneration. I hope you're starting to see some themes happening just in the last 20 minutes that we've been together around connectedness. And in connectedness, he talks about the need for leaders to have sufficiently worked on their own wounds, which echoes, I think, quite nicely what Parker Palmer was saying earlier as well. And in terms of nurturing a regenerative organisation, is one where employees and communities can naturally give the best of themselves. I think that's a key word, how they can naturally give the best of themselves. So when we talk about trust, we've spent a lot of time examining trust from a very cerebral perspective, from a perspective that is a very rational way. And I invite you to consider, and for us to explore for a moment, what we call attunement. So let's examine trust from another perspective. And where and what are you attuned to? Let's have a look at this practice. The biggest tool we have available to us is really paying attention. We need to understand and experience that paying attention is much more than thinking. We talk about micro-presencing, noticing more, noticing your environment, noticing what your body is saying, noticing the temperature, being attuned so beautifully that you're starting to feel someone else's interior world. So my thinking remains an important part of my toolkit, but it's not my most dominant part all the time. Professor Lee Burrows, who is an educator and a mindfulness and contemplative specialist at Flinders University here in South Australia, talks about the fact that mindfulness can be seen as a gradual process of compassionate attunement to self, others, and the environment, and has scaffolded and built on Jung's body of work, and has examined attunement by examining these different ways of knowing. So many of us are very familiar, again, with the rational ways of knowing, where we're attuned to cognition, to ideas, to concepts and research. That's thinking. Or emotional ways of knowing, where we're attuned to others through empathy, connection, community, feeling. Another word for that might be the emotional intelligence that many of us have learnt more and more of. And then there's the physical ways of knowing and our orientation and attunement to our environment through the senses. So a sensing way of knowing. But this is the piece that I find really interesting and relevant, especially in our conversation today around leadership and trust, and that is intuitive ways of knowing, where we are so finely attuned to our inner insights, our epiphanies, perhaps our sleeping dreams, our daydreams that help guide us. So when we talk about trust, the conversation so far has predominantly been on trusting others. What I'm particularly curious about is how much do you trust yourself? How finely tuned is your own intuition? Do you trust yourself? So there's different ways of understanding and approaching intuition. For many leaders in the 21st century, the world is no longer understood as operating in a linear, logical, or concrete manner. And this represents a fundamental shift from the previous mechanistic and reductionist mental models that have dominated the leadership and management sphere. The prominent disciplines of knowing and leadership have valued and sought to understand issues through that step-by-step reasoning. Linear and rational ways of knowing have dictated much of leadership development in the past. However, as leaders, you in the room are increasingly being asked to operate within complex interrelationships and patterns within globalized economies. So we have to be able to access other ways of knowing beyond the rational and the linear. We know these are really important. Clarissa Pinkola-Estes, one of the world's greatest Jungian psychoanalysts, describes intuition and its location using metaphors such as, it is the treasure of our psyche. It's akin to a divining instrument and like a crystal through which we can see with uncanny interior vision. She further describes intuition as lightning fast, inner seeing, inner hearing, inner sensing, and inner knowing. You know, for most of us, we know, can almost smell trust, but we may not listen to our intuition, and then we spend a whole bunch of time either rationalizing another way of understanding the situation. So how do we develop what I think is actually a superpower? Well, it seems the best way we can do that is being really conscious about eliminating clutter and distractions from our life. And so contemplative practices are an excellent way to develop this. Just as an aside, and I haven't put this in my slides, everyone, but in my research, an unexpected finding around intuition was actually our physical health too. So it seems that it's very important that we keep our bodies and our mental health very strong, because it does impact on this way of knowing. So there's two distinct types of intuition though that is important to share, and that's intuitive judgment and intuitive insight. And the differentiation here is that intuitive judgment is seen as a consequence of intuitive insight, which has expressed qualities such as empathy, whole picture thinking, and timing. I hope you can start to see the link between those words and also the post-heroic leadership qualities that I was talking about earlier. I'll reference Otto Scharmer again. He talks about generative listening and the need to understand that there are different types of listening. There's factual, empathic, and generative and downloading. And within our own culture here in Australia, an Aboriginal terminology called Dundari, which is a way of listening that's likened to generative listening, that Miriam Rose, who's a Daly River elder, states that Dundari recognises the deep spring that is inside us, the gift that Australia is thirsting for. So have a think for a moment. How do you develop the superpower of your own intuition? What will you need to remove to allow the essential to speak? And do you trust yourself? And if you're starting to question your own judgment, what's getting in the way for you? So let's have a look at some practices to build trust, to foster that intuition. And here we're going to look at relational intelligence. And relational intelligence, I believe, is the beautiful synthesis between intuition and sensing, those two very powerful ways of knowing. And I'm going to draw from a woman called Esther Perel. If you've not heard of Esther Perel, I highly recommend look her up. She's done some fabulous work. She's a Belgian psychotherapist, and she spent the last 30 years working with people at the coalface, examining relationships, trust, betrayal, and deceit. And she says, the quality of your life ultimately depends on the quality of your relationships, which are basically a reflection of your sense of decency, your ability to think of others, and your generosity. She goes on to say that every one of us comes into this world struggling between two sets of fundamental human needs. We all have a need for security, for safety, for dependability, for predictability, for belonging, for continuity. But we also equally have a strong need for everything in between, for adventure, for novelty, for mystery, for risk-taking, for exploration. And all of us, from the minute we come into the world, need to negotiate both our need for security and our need for adventure, our need for connection and our need for autonomy, our need for togetherness and our need for freedom, our need for love and our need for desire. And some of us came out of a childhood and our histories that may have required us to have a greater need for security, for safety and protection. And some of us perhaps have a greater need from these early histories for space, for freedom, for choice and for self-expression. And in psychoanalytic terms, we vacillate between what we call eros and thanatos, the life and death forces. So Perel states that there are those people who are not dead, and there are those people who are alive. So the term relational intelligence, and this is another superpower, is identified as the ability to connect with others within the workplace and to establish mutual trust. We can't confuse it, though, with emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is the focus on your ability to deal with your own emotions while hopefully maturely handling other interpersonal relationships and navigating the emotions of others. Relational intelligence is about being really connected and the ability to stay connected, particularly when there's challenges and difficult tasks. And it is the glue that keeps us together when there's been violations of trust. So I'm going to ask you an invitation to reflect on relational intelligence. And again, in the spirit of time, we won't have time to go through all of this, but maybe just pick one out of these questions. And the invitation is for you to perhaps continue this in your own time at home or wherever you feel it's the right space for you to have this inquiry within yourself. And here are some questions. They seem simple, but they will have complex answers. Where did you learn to safely trust? So, for example, Did I learn to safely trust the people in my family, in my community? What are 2 key messages about relationships that I received from my family and my community? Were you raised for autonomy or interdependence? Where did you learn about love? And who has been a mentor for you about life? Not work, because I think pretty much all of us have had mentors at work, but what about life? So this is, let's just take a minute, pick one, and just take a moment and just reflect on one of those questions. Okay. I've actually just been told I've got 5 minutes, so I'm sorry. Take a picture and of the questions if you like, and continue it in your own time. All right, it's really important that I talk about how we navigate betrayal and trust. The first thing we have to do is we have to acknowledge the wrongdoing. So when there's been a violation of trust, this is what we do to heal. Trauma begins to heal when we acknowledge the wrongdoing, and your ability to express remorse and guilt is critical because it communicates to the other person that has experienced that violation of trust that I care about you, you matter to me, and our relationship is important to me, which is what the person who's been deceived needs to know. We need to take responsibility for bringing up the betrayal. You have to be the person who holds vigil for a while in that relationship, at your work, at home, wherever it's occurred. You have to become responsible for protecting the boundaries, for bringing it up, thinking about it, so the other party doesn't have to obsess about it. This helps reassure people and it helps to build trust. You have to be the vigilante of that relationship. When you do that, you start to weave back together a new secure connection with each other. And essentially it says to the other person, I see you in your pain. I see the hurt that's been inflicted. The third thing we have to do in our organisations and at home is we have to make the space for healing. If it's you that has been the one that has violated and betrayed trust, whilst it might be very difficult to tolerate hearing about it, it's very important that we are the party that shows up. People need to talk about things when trust is broken because the narrative of their life has been ruptured. And when you make the space for healing and you ask the question, you invite people to come in and talk about things, every time the other person answers, they create a new link in the narrative of their life that helps them step by step reweave the trust. So let's look at cross-culturally a great story that helps us understand trust, and I always draw great comfort in myths and story because story is one of the great healing balms in the world, and there are universally and cross-culturally there are 4 healing balms. There's story, there's song, there's dance or movement, and there's silence, and there's 3 types of memory: skin memory, flesh memory, and bone memory. And we always draw from myth because myth has this extraordinary ability to amplify things in a way that whilst they might seem so much more magnificent and unreal, actually have an essence of truth in them that help us see things in a clearer way. Just quickly, in terms of these memories, mythologist Martin Shaw states that after telling stories for many years, he's come to the sensation that we have 3 types of memory. Skin memory is the kind of stuff that you put on your CV, the things that you've done, the things that probably get you a job. Flesh memory are the moments in life that have really impacted your heart. So, for example, divorce, falling in love, experience of illness or depression. Bone memory is when you tell a tale that could be 5 years old, 10 years old, or 1,000 years old. And it's so compelling and so alive, it touches your life as much as we're living it today. So let's have a look at some bone memory in this timeless myth called Pandora. And this myth is found in every culture. And in every culture, it may not be identified as Pandora. Sometimes it's a male, sometimes it's a female. It can be a creature of sorts. But the story is always the same. The gods and goddesses in every culture needed some kind of a project. And they decided that the project would be one where they could unite earth and eternity and divinity. So they fashioned a creature, and we're going to use the Western version here, out of earth itself, out of clay. And they gave this creature the gifts of divinity. So Venus gave this creature love, and Mercury gave this creature communication gifts, and Zeus gave this creature leadership. And they went on and on with all these gifts. So what tends to happen is we know that earth and divinity have one great quality, and that's curiosity and loving to explore anything that's new or anything that's forbidden. And we've all experienced that, right? We love to explore something new, and then we kind of want to know about this forbidden thing too. And cross-culturally, we know that this is seen as a taboo, and every culture has its taboos. So in this myth of Pandora, Pandora was given this box, this beautiful box. In some stories, it's a vase, and was told quite clearly, look after it, treasure it. And she did for many years. But then, of course, curiosity got in the way. And as humans, we carry great curiosity. And then finally one day she couldn't resist anymore, and she thought she would just lift it up a little bit and maybe just take a sneak peek. And of course, we know what happened. Lifting that lid, all the ills and the evils of the world came out. And for many people, we think that's where the story ends. But actually, when we look at the myth cross-culturally, there was always something left at the bottom of the jar and the vase that was overlooked. In Asian cultures, what was overlooked was compassion. In Western cultures, in the Pandora myth, what was overlooked was hope. And in Indigenous cultures of the world, what was overlooked was truth. So, my friends, I hope that this is where we leave it today, that I leave you with these things, compassion, truth, and hope. And that I hope for you that somehow in this presentation there's been some other insights for you to consider around different ways of knowing that can encourage you to lead and heal, and to see that these are not mutually exclusive, and that we need a different way of leading to make progress on the complex adaptive issues that we're facing in this world. And with this amazing group of people in the room, it would be my privilege to lock arms with you, literally and metaphorically, and to build more trust in this world. I thank you so much, and I wish you all the very, very best.
Thank you, Joanna. My takeaway from that, and it's a bit of a theme that's been running through today, is heal our own wounds first and then create a safe container for others.